It is March 15, 1961. In northern Angola, in the coffee plantation region between the cities of Carmona and São Salvador do Congo, thousands of men armed with machetes, axes, and some firearms attacked Portuguese farms, villages, and administrative posts. In a matter of hours, hundreds of white settlers and thousands of African workers considered loyal to the Portuguese regime are killed. Estimates vary, between 200 and 800 whites and between 6,000 and 8,000 Africans. But the brutality is undeniable. Entire families are massacred. Farms are set on fire. It is the beginning of the UPA uprising, the Union of the Peoples of Angola, led by Holden Roberto. In Lisbon, the regime of António de Oliveira Salazar, the dictator who has ruled Portugal for 33 years, receives the news with disbelief. Angola is not a colony, at least not in the legal fiction of the Estado Novo. It is an overseas province, an integral part of Portugal, as Portuguese as the Alentejo or the Minho. The idea that Africans would rebel against Portuguese sovereignty is, for the regime, literally unthinkable. 2 weeks earlier, on February 4th, a group of militants from the MPLA, Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, had already attacked the São Paulo prison and the police headquarters in Luanda, a symbolic attack with few casualties, but one that marked the first shot of the war. The events of March turned that shot into a wildfire. And the question that defines the next 13 years is this: how did Portugal, a country of 9 million inhabitants, the poorest in Western Europe, with a GDP per capita lower than that of Greece and Turkey, manage to sustain 3 simultaneous colonial wars on 3 different continents for more than a decade? And at what cost? Because there wasn't one war. There were 3. In Angola in 1961, in Guinea-Bissau in 1963, and in Mozambique in 1964. 3 fronts opened at the same time, separated by thousands of kilometers, against liberation movements supported by the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, and practically the entire international community. Portugal, alone, diplomatically isolated, governed by a dictatorship that refused to accept that the world had changed, fought these 3 wars until it destroyed itself from the inside. To understand why Portugal went to war, one must understand what the colonies meant to the regime, and to the Portuguese national identity. Portugal was, in 1961, a European anomaly. While Great Britain decolonized India in 1947, France lost Indochina in 1954 and Algeria in 1962, and Belgium dropped the Congo in 1960 in total chaos. Portugal clung to its overseas territories with a determination that seemed to come from another century. And it did. Salazar's Estado Novo was an authoritarian, corporatist, and deeply conservative regime founded in 1933 on 3 pillars: God, fatherland, and family. The colonial empire: Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, São Tomé and Príncipe, Macau, Timor, and Portuguese India. Goa, Daman, and Diu, lost to India in December 1961, was not just an economic issue. It was an existential issue. Without the colonies, Portugal was a rectangle in Iberia with 9 million inhabitants, no heavy industry, no significant natural resources, and no weight in the world. With the colonies, it was a country from the Minho to Timor, a pluricontinental empire with 2.1 million square kilometers, present on 3 continents. Salazar built the entire legitimacy of the regime around this imperial fiction. The propaganda of the Estado Novo hammered endlessly: Portugal is not a small country. Official maps superimposed the territory of the colonies over Europe to show that overseas Portugal covered an area larger than all of Western Europe. Without it, we would be a small nation. With it, we are a great country. António de Oliveira Salazar, speech in the National Assembly, 1960. Salazar's response to the liberation movements was a phrase that became official policy: to Angola, move rapidly and in force. And so, Portugal went to war. The liberation movements in each territory had their own dynamics, leaders, ideologies, and sponsors, but they shared a common cause: the end of Portuguese colonial rule. Angola was the most complex case because it had not 1 but 3 liberation movements fighting against Portugal, and frequently against each other. The MPLA, Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, founded in 1956, was led by Agostinho Neto, a doctor and poet educated in Lisbon. It had its base among the Mbundu of central northern Angola and the Creoles of Luanda. It was Marxist-Leninist and supported by the Soviet Union and Cuba. It operated mainly in eastern Angola, the Eastern Front, and in the outskirts of Luanda, the Luanda Front. The FNLA, National Front for the Liberation of Angola, led by Holden Roberto, had its base among the Bakongo of the north and was supported by Mobutu's Zaire, whose country shared a long border with Angola, by the United States and, initially, by China. The FNLA was responsible for the March 1961 uprising and operated almost exclusively from the north. The UNITA, National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, founded in 1966 by Jonas Savimbi, a former member of the FNLA who broke with Holden Roberto, had its base among the Ovimbundu of the Central Plateau, the largest ethnic group in Angola. UNITA received support from China and, later, from South Africa. It operated in the east and south-central regions. This fragmentation was, paradoxically, an advantage for Portugal. The three movements wasted energy fighting each other, and a curse, because it meant there was no single enemy that could be defeated or negotiated with. Guinea-Bissau, the most dangerous theater. Guinea-Bissau was the smallest territory, with 36,125 square kilometers, but it became the most difficult theater of war for Portugal. The reason had a name: Amílcar Cabral. The PAIGC, African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, founded by Cabral in 1956, was perhaps the most sophisticated of the African liberation movements. Cabral, an agronomist educated in Lisbon, a brilliant intellectual, a first-rate political and military strategist, built an organization that combined rural guerrilla warfare, grassroots political mobilization, and an ideological vision that transcended imported Marxism. Cabral spoke of the liberation of mentalities, not just of territories. The PAIGC was supported by the Soviet Union, Cuba, China, and neighboring African countries, especially the Guinea Conakry of President Sékou Touré and Senegal. From 1963, with secure bases in Guinea Conakry and Senegal, the PAIGC launched a guerrilla war that, in a few years, effectively controlled more than two-thirds of the territory of Guinea-Bissau. We are not fighting simply to hoist a flag in our country and have a national anthem. We are fighting so that never again will one people exploit another people. Amílcar Cabral, speech at the Tricontinental Conference, Havana, January 1966. The war in Mozambique began on September 25, 1964, when Frelimo, the Mozambique Liberation Front, launched its first attacks in the Chai district, in the Cabo Delgado province, in the extreme north of the territory. Frelimo had been founded in 1962 by the merger of three smaller movements, under the leadership of Eduardo Mondlane, a Mozambican academic educated in the United States who taught at Northwestern University. Mondlane was assassinated by a book bomb in February 1969, probably the work of the PIDE, the Portuguese political police, although there are also theories of internal dissent. His successor, Samora Machel, was a completely different man, charismatic, radical, a military man by instinct, and he would prove to be a formidable adversary. Frelimo was supported by the Soviet Union, China, and Tanzania, which served as a rear base. It initially operated in the northern provinces, Cabo Delgado and Niassa, but gradually expanded southwards, opening the Tete Front in the late 1960s and threatening the strategic Cahora Bassa project, a hydroelectric dam on the Zambezi River that Portugal considered the symbol of its determination to stay. Portugal did not have the resources to fight three wars, and that is exactly what it did. In 1961, the Portuguese armed forces were prepared for one scenario: defending NATO's Atlantic flank in Europe, not fighting guerrillas in the African tropical jungle. The army had equipment from the Second World War and the Korean War: 7.92mm Mauser rifles, some G3 rifles that were beginning to arrive from Germany, obsolete armored vehicles, an air force dependent on old T-6 Texan, PV-2 Harpoon bombers, and, later, German Fiat G91 jets. The logistical desperation was such that Portugal had to clandestinely buy B-26 bombers on the international black market to bypass the USA arms embargo. But what Portugal lacked in technology, it made up for in three things: adaptation, improvisation, and the brutality of human effort. Compulsory military service lasted, in the 1960s, up to 4 years, 2 of which in an overseas commission. Practically all Portuguese men of military age between 1961 and 1974 served in the colonial wars or knew someone who did. The army grew from about 79,000 effectives in 1961 to a peak of more than 217,000 in 1974, of which approximately 149,000 were deployed in the 3 African theaters of operations, about 65,000 in Angola, 32,000 in Guinea, and 52,000 in Mozambique. For a population of 9 million, these numbers are proportionally enormous, the equivalent of the United States keeping more than 5 million soldiers in combat simultaneously. The financial effort was equally disproportionate. Military spending absorbed between 30% and 44% of the state budget, depending on the year and the method of calculation, a burden that suffocated all other sectors. Health, education, infrastructure. Everything was sacrificed at the altar of the colonial war. Portugal was, in the mid-1960s, the NATO country with the highest percentage of its budget dedicated to defense, and simultaneously the poorest. Emigration, already traditional in Portugal, exploded. Between 1961 and 1974, it is estimated that between 1 and 1.5 million Portuguese emigrated to France, Germany, Luxembourg, Brazil, and other destinations, many of them young men of military age fleeing conscription. Entire villages in northern Portugal were left without men. The women, the elderly, and the children stayed. The husbands, sons, and brothers went to Africa or Europe. My village in the Minho had 200 inhabitants when I was a boy. When I returned from Guinea in 1971, it had 60. The men had all gone, some to the war, others to France. The women did everything, the farming, the cattle, the children, everything. Manuel Ferreira, veteran of the Guinea War, interview for the project. Wars of Memory, RTP, 2007. Portugal's response to the March 1961 uprising in northern Angola is brutal and massive. Salazar sends thousands of troops. The first contingents arrive by air in Norrie transport planes, and unleashes an operation of reconquest that lasts for months. The Portuguese forces, infantry battalions, rifle companies, paratroopers, and marines, advance through the north from Luanda and the urban centers, reoccupying the areas controlled by the rebels. The operation is accompanied by reprisals that international organizations and the foreign press denounce. Villages leveled, summary executions, napalm bombings of rural areas. The PIDE, the political police, operates with systematic brutality, arresting, torturing, and executing those suspected of collaborating with the liberation movements. But the counteroffensive works, at least militarily. In a few weeks, northern Angola is retaken. The UPA and FNLA is pushed back to the border areas with the Congo. The MPLA, weaker on the ground at this stage, limits itself to sporadic operations. Until the mid-1960s, Angola is the most controlled theater of the three. The problem is that controlling is not solving. The movements did not disappear, they reorganized, rearmed, and opened new fronts. The MPLA opens the Eastern Front in 1966, infiltrating guerrillas through Zambia to operate in the vast Angolan East, a region the size of France with minimal population density and almost non-existent infrastructure. Portugal developed a counterinsurgency approach in Angola that, in many respects, was sophisticated for the time. General Francisco da Costa Gomes, one of the most intelligent officers in the Portuguese army, a future president of the Republic, implemented a strategy that combined military operations with what he called psychosocial action, the construction of schools, health posts, roads, protected settlements, and the promotion of self-defense among local populations. The aldeamentos, the Portuguese version of the strategic hamlets in Vietnam, concentrated rural populations in fortified locations to separate them from the guerrillas. In Angola, it is estimated that more than 1 million peasants were displaced to these settlements throughout the war. The results were mixed. In some areas, security improved. In others, the settlements were open-air prisons that generated resentment. Portugal also massively recruited African soldiers. In Angola, the so-called special troops, like the Flechas, a counter-guerrilla unit composed of ex-guerrillas and San Bushmen, trained and operationally commanded by inspectors of the political police, the PIDE or DGS, operating outside the regular structure of the army, became one of the most effective forces in the theater. The Flechas operated in small groups with intimate knowledge of the terrain and the habits of the enemy, and carried out reconnaissance, ambush, and tracking operations that conventional units could not replicate. The Flechas were our eyes and ears in the bush. Without them, we walked blind. They knew every trail, every village, every stream. They could read the terrain like we read a map. They were the best trackers I ever saw. Rushing rivers, mangrove swamps, dense forest, flooded rice fields, and a rainy season that lasted from June to November, transforming the country into an impassable quagmire. The roads, few and poorly maintained, became impassable for months. The heat was suffocating, the humidity brutal, and tropical diseases, malaria, cholera, parasites, claimed Portuguese troops as much or more than bullets. Amílcar Cabral's PAIGC exploited these conditions masterfully. From 1963 onwards, the guerrillas, armed with Soviet AK-47 rifles, RPG-7s, mortars, and, starting in 1973, SA-7 Strela anti-aircraft missiles, progressively controlled the interior of the territory. Cabral's strategy was classic but executed with rare discipline: control the countryside, isolate the urban garrisons, create liberated zones with parallel administrative structures, schools, health posts, people's courts, and demonstrate to the international community that the PAIGC was, in practice, the government of a large part of Guinea. And it worked. In 1968, Portuguese estimates internally acknowledged that the PAIGC effectively controlled about 50% to 60% of the territory. By 1973, that number reached 2/3. The Portuguese garrisons, scattered in small barracks throughout the interior, many with fewer than 100 men, lived essentially in a state of siege. The Portuguese soldier in Guinea faced conditions that tested the limit of what a human being can endure. The tour of duty lasted 2 years. The climate was a constant enemy. Temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius with humidity above 90% for months. Malaria was epidemic. Despite chloroquine pills, practically all soldiers caught the disease at least once. Patrolling operations meant marching for days through the flooded fields and the bush, carrying 25 to 30 kilograms of equipment, with water up to the waist, under the permanent risk of an ambush or a mine. Anti-personnel mines were a terror. The PAIGC sowed thousands of mines, many of them Soviet PMNN models, on paths, on roads, and on the approaches to garrisons. A significant part of the Portuguese casualties in Guinea, both dead and mutilated, was due to mines. The image of the Portuguese soldier with one or both legs amputated became one of the most painful symbols of the war. A militia ensign, a reserve officer like most subalterns in the Colonial War, describes a typical patrol. We left the barracks at 5 in the morning, before the heat. We walked single file, with 5 meters between each man because of the mines. The first in line was always an African, a local guide or a soldier from the battalion. I'm not going to lie, we put the Africans in front. They knew the terrain, but the truth is they were also the first to step on the mine. We walked for hours without seeing anyone. And then, suddenly, shots came from everywhere and you couldn't see anything, just bush. We shot into the bush. We called for air support. By the time the T-6 planes arrived, the PAIGC had already disappeared. Militia Ensign, Rifle Battalion, 2852, Guinea, 1968. In May 1968, General António de Spinola is appointed Governor and Commander-in-Chief of Guinea. He is a charismatic man, wearing a monocle and a beret, an almost anachronistic figure who combines aristocratic vanity with real strategic intelligence. Spinola understands something that most leaders of the Estado Novo refuse to accept. The war in Guinea cannot be won by military means alone. A political dimension is needed, to win over the population, to offer an alternative to the PAIGC. He implements an ambitious program he calls Better Guinea, the construction of schools, hospitals, infrastructure, the promotion of loyal African leaders, the partial Africanization of the military forces. Africans come to represent more than 50% of the military effectives in Guinea. The organization of people's congresses and attempts at dialogue with ethnic leaders. Militarily, Spinola reorganizes the forces and bets on the African commandos, elite units composed of Guinean soldiers led by Portuguese officers, who become some of the most effective troops in the theater. He launches offensive operations against PAIGC bases in the border areas and intensifies air incursions. But Spinola knows that all of this is insufficient as long as the PAIGC has sanctuaries in Guinea-Conakry and Senegal. And that is where the most daring and most controversial operation of the entire colonial war is born. In the early hours of November 22, 1970, an amphibious force of approximately 400 men, Portuguese Marines, African commandos, and agents of the DGS, the successor to the PIDE, lands in Conakry, the capital of the Republic of Guinea-Conakry. The objectives are multiple and extremely ambitious: to free Portuguese prisoners of war held by Sékou Touré's regime, to destroy PAIGC speedboats anchored in the port, and, according to many sources, to capture or eliminate Amílcar Cabral and possibly overthrow Sékou Touré himself. The operation is a partial tactical success. The commandos free 26 Portuguese prisoners of war and destroyed several vessels, but a total strategic and diplomatic failure. Cabral is not found, he was not in Conakry. Sékou Touré survives. And the international community reacts with fury. Portugal has just militarily attacked a sovereign state and member of the United Nations. The UN Security Council condemns Portugal. The diplomatic isolation deepens. Operation Mar Verde was militarily competent and politically disastrous. It demonstrated that Portuguese special forces were capable of power projection, but it also demonstrated the desperation of a regime that attacked neighboring countries because it could not defeat the guerrilla insurgency in its own territory. John P. Cann, Counterinsurgency in Africa, The Portuguese Way of War, 1961–1974. On January 20, 1973, Amílcar Cabral is assassinated in Conakry, shot by dissidents within the PAIGC itself. The involvement of the PIDE or DGS in the assassination has been long debated. Most historians consider that Portuguese intelligence infiltrated and manipulated the dissidents, although the direct execution was the work of party members. Cabral's death. The most charismatic and intellectually respected leader of all African liberation movements, does not destroy the PAIGC. His brother, Luis Cabral, takes over the leadership, and the struggle intensifies. In 1973, the arrival of SA-7 Strela missiles changes the balance. The Portuguese Air Force, which relied on slow planes like the T-6 Texan and the Fiat G91 for close air support, begins to suffer losses. 2 Fiat G91s are shot down. Air supremacy, Portugal's only incontestable trump card, is at risk. On September 24, 1973, the PAIGC unilaterally declares the independence of Guinea-Bissau. 82 countries recognize the new state before the end of the year, including the United Nations General Assembly. Portugal controls Bissau, some coastal cities, and the barracks, and little else. The war in Guinea is, in practice, lost. The war in Mozambique begins on September 25, 1964, when Frelimo guerrillas attack the administrative post of Chai in the Cabo Delgado province. The early years are a low-intensity war confined to the two northern provinces, Cabo Delgado and Niassa, which border Tanzania, Frelimo's rear base. Mozambique is enormous, 801,590 square kilometers, more than 8 times the size of mainland Portugal. Population density is low in the northern provinces, infrastructure is minimal, and the jungle is dense. Frelimo operates in small groups, attacks isolated villages and posts, mines roads, and ambushes military columns. The Portuguese forces, initially with insufficient effectives, respond with patrolling, search and destroy operations, and the usual strategy of settlements. The assassination of Eduardo Malyn in February 1969 provokes an internal crisis in Frelimo, but the rise of Samora Machel to leadership proves to be even worse news for Portugal. Machel is more aggressive, more pragmatic, and more willing to expand the war. In 1970, Portugal tries to resolve Mozambique with the largest military operation of the entire colonial war, Operation Gordian Knot. The architect is General Couelza de Arriaga, an ambitious, conservative, and staunchly colonialist officer who believes that Frelimo can be destroyed with a massive military blow. The operation involved a maneuver force of about 8,000 to 10,000 elite troops, part of the contingent of 35,000 men stationed in the theater of operations, including battalions of commandos, paratroopers, marines, special groups, which were African counter-guerrilla units, air support from Fiat G91s, and Alouette 3 helicopters. The plan is a large-scale conventional offensive on the Maconde Plateau in Cabo Delgado, the heart of the territory controlled by Frelimo. Portuguese forces launch encirclement and sweep operations, establish forward bases, carry out intensive air bombardments, and try to pin down and destroy the guerrillas. The numbers are impressive. During the 2 months of the operation, Portuguese forces report having destroyed 61 Frelimo bases, captured hundreds of tons of material, and caused several hundred casualties to the guerrillas. Couelza de Arriaga declares the operation a success. The reality is different. Frelimo, applying classic guerrilla doctrine, refuses frontal combat. The guerrillas disperse, hide their weaponry, blend in with the population, and wait. When the Portuguese withdraw, because they cannot keep 35,000 men indefinitely in a single region while the other fronts demand attention, Frelimo returns. Within weeks, the destroyed bases are rebuilt. But we couldn't be everywhere at the same time. And that was the problem. We destroyed one base and the guerrillas opened another. It was like trying to dry the sea with a sponge. Major Matos Gomes, Commandos, Mozambique, 1971. Even worse, while Couelza de Arriaga concentrated forces in the north, Frelimo opened a new front in the Tete province in central Mozambique, directly threatening the construction of the Cahora Bassa Dam, the largest civil engineering project in the colonial empire, financed by an international consortium led by South Africa. The protection of Cahora Bassa now required thousands of additional soldiers. In December 1972, Portuguese soldiers, including elements of the special groups and possibly commandos, massacre between 150 and 400 civilians in the village of Wirayamu in the Tete district. Men, women, and children are killed. The massacre is denounced by the Spanish missionary priest Father Burgos and made public by the British priest and academic Adrian Hastings in the Times newspaper in July 1973, precisely when Marcelo Caetano, Salazar's successor, visits London. The timing is devastating. Caetano denies it. The army denies it. But the evidence accumulates. The Wirayamu massacre, along with other less documented incidents, demonstrates that the war in Mozambique was deteriorating not only militarily, but morally. Brutalization is the classic symptom of a war with no way out. It is important to tell this story from the other side as well. The African guerrilla fighter, whether from the MPLA, the PAIGC, or Frelimo, fought under conditions that, in many ways, were worse than those of the Portuguese soldier. Weapons were frequently obsolete or insufficient, although Soviet and Chinese supply improved over the years. Food depended on what local communities could provide or what was grown at the bases. Medical care was rudimentary. A serious injury often meant death, because field hospitals were tents in the bush with a nurse and little else. But the guerrillas had something the Portuguese did not have: time and a cause. They fought for the independence of their country. They knew that, in the long run, history was on their side. Colonial empires were falling all over Africa, and Portugal could not hold out indefinitely against the tide of history. External support, Soviet weaponry, Cuban instructors, training in China, diplomatic support from the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, reinforced this certainty. A Frelimo combatant interviewed decades later summarizes, "We knew that they had planes and we did not. They had artillery and we did not. They had more soldiers and more weapons. But we had the land. It is our land. They would leave. Sooner or later, they would leave. We would stay. That changes everything." Acher. Anonymous Frelimo combatant, 1979. The Portuguese colonial war, like all counterinsurgency wars, had its greatest victims in civilians. Forced settlements displaced millions of people across the three territories. In Angola, more than 1 million peasants were relocated. In Mozambique, the number was similar. In Guinea, the scale was smaller, but the impact was proportionally equal. People lost their land, their homes, their family cemeteries, everything that defined their identity and livelihood, and were placed in clusters surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by the army, where they depended on the goodwill of the authorities to eat. Air bombings, with napalm, white phosphorus, and conventional bombs, hit rural areas where the distinction between guerrilla base and civilian village was often non-existent or irrelevant to whoever was flying the plane. Reprisals against populations suspected of supporting the guerrillas, burning crops, destroying cattle, arbitrary arrests, torture, were practices documented by Amnesty International, the Red Cross, and foreign missionaries operating in the territories. Refugees numbered in the hundreds of thousands. From Angola, they fled to the Congo, Zaire, and Zambia. From Mozambique to Tanzania and Malawi. From Guinea to Senegal and Guinea-Conakry. And the violence did not just come from the Portuguese side. The liberation movements also committed atrocities, executions of traitors and collaborators, forced recruitment, brutal discipline. In Angola, the March 1961 uprising and the subsequent massacres perpetrated by the UPA and FNLA against African workers of other ethnicities showed that colonial violence was intertwined with ethnic tensions that would explode after independence. Between 1961 and 1974, more than 800,000 Portuguese served in the armed forces during the Colonial War, in a population that barely exceeded 9 million. In proportional terms, it is a mobilization effort comparable to that of the United States in the Second World War. The typical soldier was young, 20 to 22 years old. Of rural or working-class origin, with low education, many had only 4th grade and served out of obligation, not out of conviction. The militia officers, young university students drafted to command platoons overseas, were frequently the most politicized and the most critical of the war. Many would come to play central roles in the revolution of 1974. The combat experience was marked by monotony interspersed with terror. Long weeks of patrolling with no contact, punctuated by sudden ambushes, mine explosions, and brief but intense firefights. The psychological tension was amplified by the difficulty of identifying the enemy. In a guerrilla scenario, any civilian could be a combatant. Returning to Portugal was often as difficult as the war. there were no reintegration programs. The Estado Novo did not recognize that veterans might have psychological problems, because to recognize that would be to recognize that the war was traumatic, and to recognize that the war was traumatic was to admit that perhaps it was not worth it. The nightmares, alcoholism, domestic violence, isolation, all of this was treated as an individual problem, not as a collective consequence. No one ever asked me what had happened in Africa. Not my family, not the state. It was as if it hadn't existed. I came back, went to work at the factory, and that was it. But the nights were bad. For years, I woke up thinking I was in the bush, that I heard shots. My wife learned not to touch me when I was sleeping. Anonymous veteran soldier, Mozambique, 1969 to 1971. In February 1974, General António de Spinola, the man with the monocle, the hero of Guinea, the vice chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces, publishes a book that acts as a political bomb, Portugal in the Future. The central thesis is devastating in its simplicity. The war cannot be won militarily. A political solution is necessary. Portugal must accept the principle of self-determination for the colonies, within a federal framework that preserves some connection to the metropolis. The book does not advocate for independence. It advocates for a federation. But for Marcelo Caetano's regime, even that is heresy. Spinola is dismissed. The General Staff closes ranks. But the damage is done. Spinola said out loud what the captains and majors fighting in Africa had known for years: the war is unsustainable. And those captains and majors, organized since 1973 in the Movement of Captains, which will become the Armed Forces Movement, the MFA, are preparing something. Spinola's book didn't tell us anything we didn't know, but he said it in public, and said by a general, it carried a different weight. From then on, the question wasn't whether there was a military solution. Everyone knew there wasn't. The question was, who was going to have the courage to end this? Major Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, MFA. At 20 minutes past midnight on April 25, 1974, Radio Renascença broadcast the song Grandola, Vila Morena, by José Afonso, the agreed-upon signal for the start of the military operation that will overthrow the regime. The MFA units, captains, majors, some lieutenant colonels, moved from Santarém, from the Practical School of Cavalry, from the Engineering Regiment, from the Practical School of Military Administration, and from other units. The Panhard EBR and Hymy V200 armored vehicles, the same ones that fought in Africa, advance on Lisbon. The Carmo headquarters, where Marcelo Caetano takes refuge, is surrounded. There is no significant resistance. The PIDE or DGS fires into the crowd gathering at its headquarters on Antonio Maria Cardoso Street. 4 dead, the only ones of the revolution. The rest is peaceful. At 7:30 in the evening, Caetano surrenders to General Spinola, being a senior officer, an acceptable face for the transition. The people take to the streets. The flowers, red carnations, are placed in the barrels of the rifles. It is the Carnation Revolution. In a few hours, 48 years of dictatorship end. And with it, the war. The relationship between the colonial war and the revolution is direct and unambiguous. It wasn't ideology that overthrew the Estado Novo. It was the military, the very ones the regime had sent to fight in Africa and who, tired of a meaningless war, turned their weapons against the regime itself. Decolonization was the second pillar, and the first in the minds of many of the conspirators. Portuguese decolonization was one of the fastest and most chaotic in history. Guinea-Bissau, which had already declared independence unilaterally in 1973, is recognized by Portugal on September 10, 1974. The transition is relatively orderly. Mozambique becomes independent on June 25, 1975, under the government of Frelimo led by Samora Machel. The majority of the Portuguese settler population, about 200,000 people, flees to Portugal, often with little more than the clothes on their backs. They are the retornados, or returnees, hundreds of thousands of Portuguese who had lived in Africa for generations and who, from one day to the next, lost everything. Their integration into Portugal, an already poor country in political turmoil, was one of the most intense social dramas in recent Portuguese history. Angola is the worst case. Independence, on November 11, 1975, is declared in a power vacuum. The three movements, MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA, cannot reach an agreement. Portugal, which signed the Alvor Agreements in January 1975 establishing a tripartite transitional government, watches helplessly as the process disintegrates. The Angolan Civil War begins even before independence and will last. with Cuban, South African, American, and Soviet interventions until 2002. The retornados from Angola, about 300,000 to 350,000 people, flee in frequently desperate conditions. Airlifts are organized. Ships are packed to the limit. Families who had lived in Luanda for 3 generations arrive in Lisbon with a suitcase and a trauma that many never overcome. The balance, the numbers. Portuguese military casualties, 1961 to 1974. All theaters dead in combat, 3,265, according to official data from the General Staff of the Armed Forces. Dead from other causes, accidents, diseases, others, 5,566. Total dead, 8,831, wounded in combat, 15,507, wounded from other causes, 14,642, total wounded, 30,149. Permanently disabled, more than 4,000 distribution by theater, approximate total dead, Angola, 3,258, Guinea-Bissau, 3,082, the theater with the highest casualty rate in proportion to force strength, Mozambique, 2,491 liberation movement casualties. The data is less precise, but combined estimates point to 25,000 to 50,000 guerrillas killed across the 3 theaters over 13 years. Civilian casualties. Estimates are even more difficult and politically sensitive. It is estimated that between 100,000 and 200,000 African civilians died in the 3 territories as a direct or indirect result of the war, including combat, bombings, forced displacement, starvation, and diseases. Financial costs. Over the 13 years, Portugal spent a percentage of its GDP on military expenditures higher than any other NATO member, between 6% and 8% of its GDP, against the NATO average of 3% to 4%. The estimated total cost of the war exceeds 200 billion escudos of the time, a colossal amount for the Portuguese economy, which represented a minimal fraction of the European economy. Emigration and displacement. Portuguese emigration. Between 1 and 1.5 million Portuguese emigrated during the period of the Colonial War, many to escape conscription. Returnees. Approximately 500,000 to 800,000 Portuguese returned from the colonies between 1974 and 1976. African refugees. Hundreds of thousands displaced across the 3 territories. A country of 9 million inhabitants cannot sustain 3 simultaneous colonial wars indefinitely against liberation movements supported by superpowers. It is simple arithmetic. Portugal spent 40% of its budget on defense, drained its youth to Africa, and slowly bled out, economically, demographically, and politically. The liberation movements, for their part, only needed to not lose. As long as they existed, they were winning. With the exception of South Africa and Rhodesia, both white minority regimes, Portugal had no significant allies on the colonial issue. The United States, despite being a NATO ally, voted against Portugal at the UN. France gave discreet support, weapons, helicopters, but never publicly. The Soviet bloc and China actively supported the liberation movements. The OAU, the Organization of African Unity, made African independence its banner. From 1973 onwards, with the admission of independent Guinea-Bissau into the United Nations, Portugal was defending a legally and politically unsustainable position. The Estado Novo was structurally incapable of accepting decolonization because its legitimacy was built upon the empire. To abdicate the colonies was to abdicate the regime's reason for being. This ideological rigidity prevented any negotiated political solution, which would have been possible in the 1960s, when the liberation movements were weaker and willing to accept federative solutions. When Caetano succeeded Salazar in 1968, there was a window of opportunity for reform. Caetano, who knew the war was unsustainable, closed it out of cowardice or an inability to confront the ultra-conservative sectors of the regime. The final paradox, the instrument the regime used to maintain the colonies, the army, became the instrument that overthrew the regime. The officers who fought in Africa returned, politicized, disillusioned, and radicalized. They saw the corruption, the incompetence, the official lies. They lived alongside Africans as brothers in arms and realized that the colonial narrative of a civilizing mission was a fiction. When the regime tried to promote militia officers coming from overseas above career officers, a merely administrative measure, but felt as an insult, the movement of captains was born. Deep down, the liberation movements were right, and that is the truth the regime never wanted to admit. The peoples of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau had the right to self-determination. Colonialism was a structural injustice, and no school or hospital built by the regime, however genuine it may have been, compensated for the fundamental fact that, 1. People was being governed by another without their consent. That simple truth was stronger than any army. There is a legitimate debate about Portuguese military performance. Authors like John P. Cann and, more recently, studies from the American School of Counterinsurgency argue that Portugal developed a notably effective counter-guerrilla doctrine for its means, integrating military operations. With psychosocial action, recruitment of African troops, and air mobility with helicopters. In Angola, Portugal was gaining ground in the early 1970s. In Guinea, Spinola's forces kept the PAIGC under pressure despite all adversities. Even in Mozambique, Frelimo never seriously threatened the central and southern zones of the territory. But not losing on the ground is not the same as winning the war. And war, as Clausewitz said, is the continuation of politics by other means. Politically, Portugal was losing, and that is what matters. The issue of Portuguese war crimes is sensitive and only partially confronted by Portuguese society. There were documented massacres. Wiriamu, Inhaminga, Mucumbura, and others in Mozambique, brutal reprisal operations in Angola, summary executions in Guinea. The PIDE or DGS systematically practiced torture in all three territories. At the same time, liberation movements also committed atrocities. Portugal never held an equivalent of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There were no war crimes trials. There was no public accounting for the excesses. Memory and institutional silence. Spinola's federal proposal, a Lusophone community, with autonomy for the territories but linked to Portugal, is sometimes presented as a missed opportunity. But most historians consider that it was unviable in 1974. The liberation movements would not have accepted anything short of total independence, and the international community would not have legitimized a solution that maintained any form of Portuguese sovereignty. The fate of the returnees, Portuguese people who lived in Africa, many of them born there, is an open wound. They lost everything and were received in Portugal with a mix of solidarity and hostility. They were called retornados, with a tone that vacillated between compassion and prejudice. Facilitated by family networks and by the energy of those who have no alternative, was, in spite of everything, one of the success stories of the Portuguese democratic transition, although the human cost was enormous. Paved the way for democracy and European integration. Without the war, April 25th would not have happened, at least not the way it did. Portugal joined the EEC, the current European Union, in 1986, 12 years after the revolution, and modernized at a pace that would have been impossible under the Estado Novo. But the war left scars. An entire generation of Portuguese men, more than 800,000, went through a traumatic experience that the country took decades to recognize. Post-traumatic stress, silence, the inability to speak. All of this marked families for generations. Only in the 1990s and 2000s, with the work of journalists like Joaquim Furtado and writers like António Lobo Antunes, did Portuguese society begin to look the colonial war straight in the face. For Africa, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau won their independence, but at a terrible price. Angola plunged into a 27-year civil war that killed hundreds of thousands. Mozambique had its own civil war from 1977 to 1992, fueled by Rhodesia and South Africa. Guinea-Bissau faced chronic instability, military coups, and persistent poverty. The colonial heritage, artificial borders, extractive economies, divided societies, destroyed infrastructure, weighed upon these countries as a burden that decades of independence have not yet completely removed. For the world, the Portuguese colonial war was the last European colonial war in Africa. When it ended in 1974 and 1975, European colonialism in Africa was over, with the exception of Namibia under South African rule and the Rhodesia issue, resolved in 1990 and 1980 respectively. Portugal, ironically, was the first European colonial empire, with the navigations of the 15th century, and the last to leave. The war demonstrated once again that colonialism cannot be maintained by force, against the will of the colonized peoples. It is the same lesson that the French learned in Algeria, the British in India, the Americans in Vietnam, and that Portugal, out of stubbornness, pride, and inertia, only learned at the cost of 13 years of war and almost 9,000 dead. On April 25, 1974, when the Carnations entered the barrels of the rifles in Lisbon, the same news was arriving by radio to the barracks in Angola, to the garrisons in Guinea, to the bases in Mozambique. Soldiers who the day before were patrolling the bush expecting an ambush learned that, suddenly, the war was over. A veteran remembers. When they told us that there had been a revolution in Portugal and that the war was going to end, there were no shouts of joy. There was silence. A very deep silence. Then, a boy from my platoon, Zé Maria from Trás-os-Montes, sat on the ground and started crying. He didn't say anything, he just cried. And I realized he wasn't crying from joy or sadness. He was crying because it was over. Simply because it was over. Of displaced lives, a dictatorship destroyed, 3 nations born, and an entire generation that lived between duty, fear, and silence, and who, 50 years later, still carry on their backs the weight of a war that Portugal took too long to end.